Welcome to Sinister Truths, where we explore the darkest, most disturbing stories ever recorded, accounts buried by time, silenced by fear, and often erased from official history. Tonight, you're joining us on a journey into one of those unsettling narratives, a story drawn from real documents and whispered records that still haunt the past. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. Whether it's late at night, early morning, or somewhere in between, we're fascinated by knowing which corners of the world and what hours of the day or night these grim truths are being heard. Settle in, lower the lights, and prepare yourself, because once a truth is uncovered on Sinister Truths, it can never be unseen. In 1853, Georgia's plantation world existed as a carefully maintained illusion, a place where white-painted columns, orderly fields, and polite Southern manners concealed a system engineered entirely around fear. The land itself seemed to breathe oppression. Vast stretches of cotton fields rolled endlessly beneath the sun, worked from dawn until darkness by enslaved bodies that were considered tools rather than lives. Every footstep on the soil carried the memory of violence, and every quiet moment held the threat of punishment. This was not merely an economic system, but a psychological regime designed to crush resistance before it could take shape. Fear was not an accidental byproduct of slavery. It was its foundation, carefully cultivated and relentlessly enforced. On Georgia plantations, power was displayed openly and constantly. Whips hung where everyone could see them, even when they were not in use. Shackles, stocks, and iron collars were kept nearby, not because they were needed every day, but because their presence alone served as a warning. Enslaved people learned quickly that silence was safer than speech, obedience safer than thought. A single accusation, a perceived glance of disrespect, or a moment of exhaustion could result in punishment, severe enough to scar the body for life. Violence was unpredictable by design, ensuring that no enslaved person could ever feel secure, even when they followed every rule. The plantation was a closed universe with its own laws, where the master's word outweighed any written statute. Courts existed, but they rarely interfered with what happened on private land. The enslaved were legally defined as property, which meant that cruelty was often framed as discipline and murder could be dismissed as loss of investment. This legal structure emboldened masters to rule with absolute authority. Their dominance extended beyond labor into every aspect of existence: food, sleep, family, and even grief. Parents could not protect their children. Husbands could not shield their wives, and bonds of love were constantly threatened by sale or separation. Georgia's climate added another layer of torment. The heat was suffocating, especially during harvest season, when bodies were pushed beyond endurance. Hunger was constant. Rations were intentionally minimal, calculated to keep enslaved workers alive but weak. Malnutrition made resistance harder, both physically and mentally. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded quarters where medical care was non-existent. Death was common, yet rarely acknowledged. A body could be buried without ceremony, its absence replaced by another purchased human being. The fear was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance. Overseers patrolled the fields, while house slaves were watched even more closely, their proximity to the master's family considered both a privilege and a risk. Informants were encouraged, turning victims against one another. Trust was dangerous. Conversations were whispered, often incomplete, because no one knew who might be listening. Children learned early that innocence offered no protection. They witnessed beatings, heard screams at night, and understood that survival required emotional numbness. Religion was twisted into a tool of control. Masters preached obedience, citing scripture to justify bondage. Enslaved people were told that suffering was God's will, that rebellion would condemn their souls. Yet beneath this imposed doctrine, many clung to a quieter, forbidden faith, one that promised justice beyond the plantation gates. These secret beliefs were a source of comfort, but also of risk. Gatherings could be punished harshly, as they were seen as potential breeding grounds for rebellion. The plantation economy depended on this atmosphere of terror. Cotton profits rose as fear kept productivity high. Every scream, every scar translated into bales shipped north and overseas. The wealth generated by this suffering funded elegant homes, fine clothing, and lavish dinners, creating a grotesque contrast between luxury and misery. Guests might visit a plantation and see only what the master wished to show: smiling servants, orderly fields, a facade of harmony. What they did not see were the locked doors, the bruises hidden beneath clothing, and the silent rage simmering just below the surface. Women experienced a particular kind of horror within this system. Enslaved women were expected to work the fields, maintain households, and bear children, all while being denied ownership of their own bodies. Sexual violence was widespread and rarely acknowledged. Resistance could result in brutal punishment, yet compliance offered no safety, only continued exploitation. Children born from these assaults inherited the status of enslaved, turning personal trauma into generational bondage. The plantation thus became a place where intimacy itself was weaponized. Children, too, were shaped by fear. Enslaved children were forced into labor at a young age, their play replaced by responsibility. They learned to read the moods of adults, to anticipate violence before it erupted. White children raised within this system absorbed its values as normal. They witnessed domination daily and learned that cruelty carried no consequences. This normalization of violence ensured that the system would reproduce itself, passing fear and power from one generation to the next. Runaways were the system's greatest anxiety. The mere idea that someone could escape challenged the myth of total control. As a result, punishment for attempted escape was severe and public. Whippings, brandings, and mutilations were performed as warnings. Notices describing runaway slaves were posted, reducing human beings to physical descriptions and rewards. Even those who never attempted escape lived with the knowledge that the desire itself was dangerous. By 1853, tensions were rising across the South. Abolitionist voices grew louder, and rumors of revolt circulated among plantations like forbidden whispers. Masters responded by tightening control, increasing patrols, and intensifying punishments. Fear escalated on both sides. Enslaved people feared punishment, while masters feared rebellion. This mutual terror created an unstable environment where extreme actions became more likely. When a system relies entirely on violence, it inevitably produces violence in return. Within this oppressive world, the plantation functioned like a pressure chamber. Every injustice added weight. Every humiliation increased the strain. Outwardly, life appeared routine, even calm. Crops were planted, meals were prepared, children laughed in the yard. But beneath this surface, anger and despair accumulated silently. The system offered no legal path to justice, no recognized humanity, no relief from suffering. It demanded submission while providing nothing in return. Understanding this environment is essential to understanding what would later occur. Acts that seem unimaginable outside this context were born from years of terror and dehumanization. The plantation was not just a setting, but a force, shaping behavior through relentless cruelty. It trained people to suppress empathy, to obey without question, and to survive at any cost. In such a place, the boundary between victim and monster could blur. Forged by a system that thrived on fear and fed on human suffering, she was known on the plantation by a name that was not her own, a shortened sound given to her by people who never asked what she had been called before chains decided her identity. Whatever name her mother whispered into her ear as a child had been lost somewhere between the auction block and the red Georgia soil. By 1853, she existed as a presence more than a person. Moving quietly through the master's house and surrounding yards, her footsteps learned to be light, her eyes trained to lower themselves before they invited attention. She was neither young nor old, existing in that hollow middle age carved by labor, where the body is worn down long before its time and the soul grows cautious from too many lessons learned the hard way. Her days began before the sun announced itself. Long before the white household stirred, she was awake, feeding fires, preparing food she would never fully eat, scrubbing floors that would never truly be clean in the eyes of those who owned her. She worked not because she was watched every moment, but because she had learned that punishment often came not from failure, but from whim. Efficiency was a survival strategy, silence and armor. She had mastered both. Those who observed her might have mistaken her for obedient, even content. That illusion was her greatest protection. Inside her, however, lived a reservoir of unspoken memory. She remembered the sound of her mother crying when she was taken away, the way grief sounded when it had no language. She remembered the auctioneer's voice, casual and bored, as if selling grain instead of flesh. She remembered hands inspecting her teeth, her arms, her hips, reducing her to usefulness. Each memory had been packed away carefully, because to dwell on them openly would have broken her long ago. Instead, they hardened into something quiet and heavy. In the master's house, she occupied a strange position. As a domestic slave, she was closer to white life than those in the fields, yet that closeness offered no safety. It only meant she saw more. She heard arguments whispered behind closed doors, witnessed cruelty wrapped in politeness, and absorbed insults delivered with smiles. She learned that proximity to power did not grant humanity. It merely exposed one to power's ugliest habits. The master's wife regarded her with suspicion, projecting her own fears onto a woman who had no right to fear at all. The master himself barely acknowledged her unless something displeased him. When he did speak, it was often to remind her of her place. The children, however, were unavoidable. They followed her movements, mimicking the tone they heard adults use, testing boundaries they were never taught to question. They pulled at her clothing, mocked her speech, laughed when she flinched. They were children, but they were also students of the world that raised them, absorbing lessons in dominance as naturally as language. Their cruelty was careless, unexamined, and therefore constant. She learned to endure their presence with the same restraint she applied to everything else, swallowing irritation before it could become visible. Hunger shaped her days as much as labor. The food she prepared was rich, heavy with meat and butter, while her own rations were sparse and repetitive. Cornmeal, scraps, whatever was deemed sufficient to keep her alive. Hunger sharpened the senses and dulled the patience. It gnawed at her body and mind alike, turning small indignities into deeper wounds. Still, she ate quietly, never complaining, never asking for more. Need was dangerous when spoken aloud. She had once tried to resist in small ways. A delayed response, a look held too long. Each time the lesson had been swift and painful. Bruises hidden beneath fabric taught her the cost of even minor defiance. Over time, resistance retreated inward. Her body complied, but her thoughts grew guarded, private, inaccessible. This internal withdrawal was not peace, but it was survival. It allowed her to function without surrendering entirely. Nights were the hardest. Exhaustion did not guarantee sleep. Memories surfaced when the house grew quiet, when the day's demands loosened their grip. She replayed moments she wished she could change, words she wished she could speak. Sometimes she imagined escape, though she knew the woods were full of dangers and the roads even more so. Escape lived in her mind not as a plan, but as a symbol, a reminder that another life was conceivable, even if unreachable. Loss had marred her deeply. She had borne children who were taken from her, sold to settle debts or expand profits. Each separation carved something out of her that never healed. Grief, when repeated often enough, transformed into something colder. It taught her not to hope, not to attach, not to expect kindness from a world that thrived on taking. These losses did not make her numb, as some might assume. They made her careful, aware that love itself could be weaponized against her. The plantation demanded performance. Enslaved people were expected to appear cheerful, grateful, loyal. She understood this expectation well. She practiced her expressions, offering smiles when required, softening her voice to avoid accusation. This performance protected her, but it also deepened the divide between her inner world and the role she played. Over time, the gap grew so wide that even she struggled to recognize herself within it. Despite everything she observed, she noticed patterns, routines, moments when supervision loosened. Observation was another survival skill, one that allowed her to anticipate danger. She knew when tempers flared, when punishments were likely, when silence was safest. This awareness did not give her power, but it gave her knowledge, and knowledge was the closest thing to control she possessed. Her anger did not erupt loudly. It simmered. It settled into her bones, slow and persistent. It was fueled by injustice witnessed daily, by the casual way suffering was dismissed, by the knowledge that no apology would ever be offered. This anger did not seek immediate expression, because immediate expression meant death. Instead, it waited, undefined even to her, shaping her perceptions and reactions in ways she did not consciously plan. To the outside world, she was invisible. To those who owned her, she was replaceable. Yet within herself, she carried a full record of what had been done to her and those like her. This record was not written, not spoken, but it existed nonetheless. It informed every decision, every silence, every restrained movement. It reminded her that the world she inhabited was built to erase her, and that erasure itself was a form of violence. By 1853, she stood at the intersection of endurance and exhaustion. She had survived longer than many, but survival had a cost. Each year added weight to the invisible burden she carried. She did not know what form the future would take, only that the present was unbearable in ways that words could not capture. In a system designed to strip away humanity, she clung to fragments of selfhood wherever she could find them, even as those fragments grew sharper, more dangerous, under the pressure of unrelenting cruelty. The master's house stood at the center of the plantation like a throne carved from wood and stolen labor, elevated both physically and symbolically above the rest of the land. Its wide porch, white columns, and polished floors projected an image of refinement meant to impress visitors and intimidate those who lived in its shadow. From a distance, it looked like stability and order, a place where authority rested naturally, as if it had grown from the soil itself. But inside, the house was not a home in the human sense. It was a command center, a space where power concentrated and radiated outward, shaping every life within reach. The master ruled not simply as an employer or landowner, but as a sovereign. His authority was personal, absolute, and rarely questioned. The law supported him, the economy rewarded him, and society excused him. On his land, his word carried the weight of judgment. He decided who worked, who rested, who ate, who suffered. There were no checks on his behavior, no meaningful oversight. If he chose to punish, there was no appeal. If he chose to forgive, it was framed as generosity rather than obligation. This imbalance was the cornerstone of plantation life. The household functioned according to strict hierarchies. At the top stood the master, whose moods dictated the atmosphere of the entire estate. Beneath him was his wife, whose authority was secondary but still formidable, often expressed through control of domestic slaves. Overseers acted as extensions of the master's will, enforcing discipline with brutality when necessary. Each layer existed to reinforce the one above it, creating a system where cruelty flowed downward and obedience was demanded upward. For enslaved people, there was no safe position within this structure, only varying degrees of exposure to harm. The master's power was theatrical as well as practical. He understood the importance of being seen as dominant. Punishments were often public, designed to instruct through fear. A whipping in the yard, a body restrained for all to witness, sent a clear message that resistance was futile. Even when violence was not visible, its possibility lingered in every room. The house itself seemed to hold that threat in its walls, reminding those who moved through it that safety was conditional and temporary. Inside the house, order was enforced through constant scrutiny. Domestic slaves were expected to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move silently, to exist without inconvenience. Mistakes, even accidental ones, were interpreted as disrespect. A spilled drink, a delayed response, a dish not polished to satisfaction could provoke punishment. This constant vigilance exhausted the mind as much as the body. The house demanded perfection from those it dehumanized, while excusing cruelty from those it empowered. The master's wife played a complex role in this environment. She was both subordinate and oppressor, constrained by her husband's authority, yet wielding her own power over enslaved women. Her insecurities often manifested as cruelty. She monitored interactions, imposed arbitrary rules, and punished perceived slights harshly. For her, maintaining dominance over enslaved women reinforced her fragile position within a pa. Triarchal system, jealousy, fear, and resentment often found expression through discipline, making the household an especially dangerous place for those trapped within it. Meals in the master's house illustrated the depth of this imbalance. The table overflowed with food produced by enslaved labor, yet the people who prepared it rarely tasted it. Enslaved servants stood silently nearby, ready to respond, while conversations flowed around them as if they were furniture. They were present but not acknowledged, visible but not seen. This ritual reinforced the idea that their purpose was service, not existence. Even abundance became a tool of exclusion. The children of the household were raised within this atmosphere of unchecked authority. They observed how adults spoke to enslaved people, how commands were given and obedience enforced. From an early age, they learned that power belonged to them by birthright. They were rarely corrected when they mistreated slaves, their behavior dismissed as childish or harmless. In reality, these interactions served as training, teaching them to equate dominance with normalcy and empathy with weakness. Privacy did not exist for enslaved people in the master's house. Their movements were tracked. their conversations monitored, their bodies inspected for signs of disobedience. Even rest was regulated. Sleep could be interrupted at any moment, summoned by a bell or a voice that did not tolerate delay. This constant intrusion stripped away any sense of personal boundary, reinforcing the idea that enslaved people belonged entirely to their owners, not just during labor, but at all times. The master's house also functioned as a place where secrets were kept and buried. Acts of violence, exploitation, and abuse occurred behind closed doors, hidden from public view. Sexual violence in particular was cloaked in silence. Victims had no language within the system to name what was done to them, and perpetrators faced no consequences. This silence was enforced through fear, ensuring that the truth remained contained within the walls that witnessed it. Despite its appearance of control, the household was built on anxiety. The master lived with the constant fear of rebellion, of poison in his food, of fire in the night. This fear fueled further cruelty, creating a cycle where violence bred paranoia, which in turn justified more violence. TS of the system. It required enslaved people to invest care where none would ever be returned. Time behaved differently inside the master's house. Days followed rigid routines, but the future was uncertain. An enslaved person could be sold, punished, or relocated at a moment's notice. This instability prevented long-term planning, keeping people focused on immediate survival rather than resistance. The master benefited from this uncertainty. As it fractured solidarity and maintained control, the physical space of the house reinforced its power. Doors separated owners from the owned, yet were thin enough to allow surveillance. Staircases, corridors, and rooms dictated movement, controlling where enslaved people could stand, wait, or pass through. Even architecture served domination, shaping behavior through design. The house was not neutral, it was an instrument. Within this environment, humanity was constantly denied. Enslaved people were addressed by first names or nicknames, never titles. Their histories were erased, their identities flattened into function. They were cooks, maids, drivers, but never individuals. This reduction made cruelty easier to administer as it required less moral reckoning. To harm a tool was not considered violence, it was maintenance. By maintaining absolute control within his household, the master reinforced his authority over the entire plantation. The house set the tone. What happened there rippled outward into the fields, the quarters, and beyond. It was a place where power was rehearsed daily, where dominance was normalized, and where fear was refined into a precise instrument, understanding. The master's household is essential to understanding the violence that emerged from it. This was not merely a backdrop, but an active force that shaped behavior on all sides. It rewarded cruelty, punished empathy, and erased accountability. In such a space, extreme actions did not arise from madness alone, but from a system that taught everyone within it that life had value only when sanctioned by power. They were born into comfort without understanding its cost, raised in a world where their smallest desires were immediately fulfilled by hands that did not belong to free people. The master's children moved through the plantation house with a sense of ownership that had been taught to them before they could fully speak. They did not learn power as an abstract concept. They lived inside it. Every command they gave was obeyed, every tantrum indulged, every cruelty excused as innocence. From their earliest years, they absorbed the unspoken lesson that some lives existed only to serve theirs. Their upbringing was carefully shaped by the adults around them, though rarely through direct instruction. They watched how their father spoke to enslaved people, how his voice hardened when displeased and softened only when obedience was absolute. They observed how their mother corrected servants sharply while maintaining a polished smile for guests. These daily performances taught the children that domination was not only acceptable, but respectable. Cruelty, when wrapped in authority, carried no shame. The children treated the enslaved woman as a fixture of the house rather than a person. She was always there, preparing food, cleaning messes, responding to calls. Her presence was so constant that it blended into the background of their lives, like furniture or walls. Because she was always available, she became invisible. And because she was invisible, they felt no obligation to consider her feelings or limits. To them, she was not someone who could be hurt, only someone who could react. They tested that reaction often. Small acts of cruelty entertained them. They hid objects and blamed her for their disappearance, watching with fascination as she was scolded or punished. They tripped her as she passed, pulled at her hair, spilled food she had prepared, and laughed when she was forced to clean it again. These acts were not planned with malice. They were spontaneous, careless, and therefore relentless. No one corrected them. No one explained that what they were doing was wrong. Silence from adults became permission. The children learned early that their words carried weight. A complaint, even a casual one, could result in punishment for an enslaved person. This knowledge gave them a dangerous sense of control. They exaggerated mistakes, invented offenses, and sometimes simply lied, knowing their version of events would always be believed. The power to cause harm without consequence became a game, one that taught them nothing about responsibility and everything about entitlement. Affection, when it appeared, was equally distorted. At times, they demanded warmth from the enslaved woman clinging to her, insisting she comfort them when they were upset. They expected her to soothe their fears, tell them stories, and offer reassurance. This emotional labor was forced, not requested. The lessons of domination were reinforced. Childhood imagination did not soften the system, it replicated it. Education further entrenched these ideas. They were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, while enslaved people were denied literacy. Knowledge itself became a symbol of superiority. Lessons about history and religion framed slavery as natural or divinely ordained, presenting their comfort as deserved rather than stolen. These narratives protected them from guilt, allowing them to grow without questioning the foundation of their lives. Punishment for the master's children was rare and mild. When they misbehaved, blame was often shifted onto servants for failing to supervise properly. This reinforced the idea that they were not accountable for their actions. Mistakes were not lessons, they were inconveniences corrected by others. Responsibility never rested with them, only authority. As they grew older, their cruelty evolved. What began as childish teasing hardened into deliberate acts meant to assert control. They learned which words humiliated most, which gestures provoked fear. They understood that enslaved people could not retaliate. This knowledge removed any restraint. Power without consequence breeds experimentation, and experimentation without empathy breeds cruelty. The enslaved woman became acutely aware of their moods. She learned to read the tension in their voices, the gleam of mischief that preceded trouble. Avoidance became another survival tactic. She stayed busy, stayed quiet, stayed out of their direct line of sight whenever possible, but complete avoidance was impossible. The children were everywhere, and their curiosity about her never fully faded. Their laughter often echoed through the house, light and carefree, a sharp contrast to the silence she maintained. That laughter, unburdened by fear, reminded her daily of the divide between their worlds. They were protected, indulged, and valued. She was expendable. This contrast sharpened her awareness of injustice, even as she buried her reactions deep inside. What made the children particularly dangerous was not that they were inherently evil, but that they were being shaped without moral boundaries. They were learning a version of humanity that excluded her entirely. In their world, kindness flowed upward or inward, never downward. Compassion was reserved for those deemed worthy. She did not qualify. Adults occasionally describe the children as spirited or strong-willed, praising traits that would have been punished harshly in enslaved people. This double standard was not lost on her. She saw how behavior was judged not by its nature, but by who exhibited it. This realization reinforced the truth she had always known. The system was not about behavior or morality, but about power. The children's future was a certainty, mapped out by inheritance and privilege. They would grow into the roles prepared for them, supported by wealth extracted from suffering. Her future, by contrast, was undefined and precarious. This imbalance weighed heavily on her, especially when she imagined the lives her own children might have lived if they had not been taken from her. Despite everything, she sometimes caught glimpses of their vulnerability, moments when fear flickered across their faces, when illness or nightmares reduced them to helplessness. In those moments, she saw not masters in training, but children shaped by a system that was also harming them, teaching them to suppress empathy and rely on dominance. These moments did not erase her anger, but they complicated it, adding layers of contradiction to emotions she was never allowed to express. By the time the events of 1853 began to take shape, The children were no longer merely background figures in her life. They were active participants in the daily pressures that wore her down. Their cruelty, casual and unchecked, became another weight added to years of abuse. They were not the architects of the system, but they were its inheritors, living proof that oppression did not end with one generation. It was taught, practiced, and normalized in the nursery as surely as in the fields, ensuring that the cycle of dominance and suffering would continue unless something shattered it from within. Hunger was not a temporary condition on the plantation. It was a permanent presence woven into every hour of the day. It began in the stomach but did not stay there. It climbed into the chest, tightened the throat, and settled behind the eyes, where it distorted thought and emotion alike. For the enslaved woman, hunger had long since stopped being a sharp pain and become a dull, constant ache, a reminder that her body existed only to be used. The rations she received were calculated with precision, never enough to satisfy, only enough to prevent collapse. Hunger kept her weak, compliant, and dependent exactly as the system intended. Each day she prepared meals that mocked her deprivation. The smells of roasting meat, baked bread, and rich gravies filled the kitchen, sinking into her clothes and skin. She stirred pots heavy with fat and seasoning, tasting only when absolutely necessary, careful not to take more than a trace. To be caught eating from the master's table without permission was a serious offense, one that could result in whipping or worse. So she learned to endure the cruelty of abundance without access, feeding others while her own body thinned and tightened around itself. Punishment on the plantation was unpredictable by design. It was not merely a response to wrongdoing, but a method of control. Sometimes it followed an actual mistake. Other times it arrived without explanation. This uncertainty kept everyone on edge. For the enslaved woman, punishment had come often enough that she no longer flinched at raised voices. Instead, her body reacted automatically, shoulders stiffening, breath shallow, mind racing through possible outcomes. Fear had become instinct. The smallest errors carried heavy consequences. A dish returned to the kitchen unfinished, a shirt not pressed to satisfaction, a child's complaint casually spoken but treated as truth. Each incident chipped away at her endurance. She learned that perfection was demanded but never sufficient. No matter how careful she was, punishment always hovered nearby, waiting for a reason or inventing one when none appeared. One particular season tested her limits more than others. The harvest had been hard, and tensions on the plantation ran high. The master's temper shortened, the mistress grew more irritable, and the overseers became more aggressive. Food rations were reduced under the excuse of scarcity, even as the household's table remained full. Hunger sharpened resentment, making each injustice feel heavier than the last. The children, sensing the strain, became bolder. Their behavior grew more reckless, their taunts more frequent. They complained of imaginary offenses, laughed when she was scolded, and seemed to enjoy the reactions their words provoked. Each complaint carried the possibility of punishment, and they knew it. The power thrilled them. For her, it was another reminder that safety did not exist, even within obedience. Sleep offered little relief. Hunger followed her into the night, twisting dreams into restless fragments. She woke often, heart racing, body tense, bracing for commands that did not come. Exhaustion layered itself over deprivation, slowing her movements and dulling her focus. This, in turn, made mistakes more likely, feeding the cycle of punishment. The system was self-reinforcing, grinding people down until breaking became inevitable. The breaking point did not arrive suddenly. It approached slowly, disguised as routine, a comment spoken too casually, a punishment delivered too harshly, a meal withheld as discipline. Each incident added weight, pressing down on a structure already weakened by years of strain. She felt herself changing, not in dramatic ways, but subtly. Her patience thinned. Her internal restraint, once carefully maintained, began to fray. One day, after hours of labor, she was accused of wasting food. The accusation was false, but truth held no power. The punishment was swift. Her evening ration reduced further, a deliberate act meant to remind her of dependence. Hunger that night was sharper than usual, gnawing at her with renewed intensity. As she lay awake, stomach cramped, mind restless, something shifted. The familiar ache was joined by a new sensation, a clarity that felt both terrifying and calming. She began to see the plantation, not just as a place of suffering, but as a machine designed to consume her. Every rule, every punishment, every deprivation served a purpose. This realization did not bring hope, but it stripped away illusion. There would be no reward for endurance, no eventual easing of cruelty. Survival itself was the only prize, and even that was conditional. Memor. Eyes of loss resurfaced with renewed force. Children taken from her arms, promises broken, moments of kindness that had led only to further pain. Hunger seemed to unlock these memories, dragging them from wherever she had buried them. Grief, long suppressed, mixed with resentment, until the two were indistinguishable. The weight of it pressed against her chest, making breath feel like effort. The next punishment came without warning. A child accused her of speaking sharply, a claim she could not disprove. The response was public humiliation, a reminder of her place delivered in front of others. Laughter followed, not just from the children, but from those who saw cruelty as entertainment. Something inside her hardened at that moment. Shame, once a powerful tool, lost its effectiveness. There was nothing left to protect. Hunger and punishment worked together to erode the boundaries she had built within herself. The careful separation between thought and action began to weaken. Ideas she would once have dismissed as dangerous now lingered longer. She did not plan anything in those moments, but she stopped pushing thoughts away. The mind, deprived and exhausted, began to wander into territory shaped by desperation rather than caution. She noticed patterns more closely. Times when supervision eased, moments when routine shifted. Hunger sharpened her attention even as it weakened her body. Punishment had taught her what not to do, but it had also taught her how the system functioned, where its cracks lay. This knowledge had once been purely defensive. Now it felt different, charged with possibility. The plantation continued its routines, unaware of the internal changes taking place. Meals were served, orders given, punishments delivered. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. But inside her, the balance that had kept her compliant was gone. Hunger no longer felt like something to endure. It felt like an insult layered atop countless others. Punishment no longer corrected behavior. It confirmed injustice. The final push was small, almost insignificant in isolation. Another reduction of food, another accusation, another reminder that she was considered less than nothing. But small pressures, applied relentlessly, can fracture even the strongest structures. In that moment, the weight of years pressed down at once, collapsing restraint into resolve. She did not feel rage in the way stories often describe it, explosive and blinding. What she felt was colder, steadier, a sense of inevitability. Hunger had stripped away excess emotion, leaving behind something sharp and focused. Punishment had taught her that mercy would never come from outside. Whatever happened next would not be an accident of passion, but the result of a system that had left no other path. This was the true breaking point, not a single event, but a culmination. Hunger weakened her body, but strengthened her awareness. Punishment aimed to enforce obedience, but instead revealed emptiness of submission. Together, they pushed her beyond fear into a space where consequences no longer held the same meaning. In a world where suffering was guaranteed and dignity denied, the line between endurance and action dissolved. Setting the stage for what would follow, what followed did not unfold in a burst of chaos or visible madness. It emerged quietly, shaped by routine, by familiarity, by a setting that had trained her for years to move without being noticed. The plantation did not sense danger because danger in this place had always flowed in only one direction. Violence was expected from above, never from below. That assumption, deeply embedded in the daily rhythms of the household, created a blindness that would not lift until it was too late. The day began like countless others. The house stirred awake. Orders were given. Small feet ran across polished floors. Nothing marked the hours as unusual. For her, this normalcy carried a strange weight, as if the world itself were holding its breath. She moved through her task with practiced calm, her expression neutral, her hands steady. Years of enforced discipline had trained her body to perform even when her mind was elsewhere. That training now served a purpose no one had imagined possible. There was no dramatic declaration, no outward sign of decision. The act did not arise from a sudden surge of emotion, but from a cold clarity forged by exhaustion and despair. In that clarity, fear lost its dominance. The consequences that had once governed every movement now felt distant, abstract. She understood them, but they no longer held power over her. When a system guarantees suffering regardless of obedience, punishment ceases to be a deterrent. It becomes background noise. The environment itself played a role. The plantation was full of hidden spaces, routines designed to separate people, moments when supervision lapsed not out of kindness, but out of complacency. She had observed these gaps for years, cataloging them unconsciously. Now that knowledge surfaced with unsettling precision. Nothing she did appeared out of place. Nothing triggered immediate suspicion. The house continued its motions, unaware that the rules governing it had already been violated in spirit. What made the act unthinkable to those who would later hear whispers of it was not only its outcome, but its inversion of power. The plantation world was built on the belief that enslaved people were incapable of agency beyond survival. To imagine one acting deliberately, decisively against the master's family challenged the core narrative that justified the system. That challenge was more terrifying than the loss itself. There was no satisfaction in what she did, no sense of triumph. The moment carried a heavy stillness, a gravity that pressed inward rather than releasing outward. Whatever anger had fueled her breaking point did not manifest as rage. Instead, there was a hollow resolve, a sense that something irreversible had been set in motion. The act did not feel like revenge. It felt like an ending. The plantation animals raised to consume what the household discarded had always been part of the background. Their presence was ordinary, unremarkable. Waste, scraps, leftovers, all were absorbed without thought. That ordinariness was part of the horror. In a system that treated human beings as consumable, the boundary between human life and refuse had long been blurred. What occurred did not introduce a new cruelty. It exposed an existing one in its most grotesque form. Silence followed. Not the tense silence of anticipation, but the everyday quiet that settles when routines continue uninterrupted. Hours passed. The absence went unnoticed at first, absorbed by the chaos of household life. Children were often elsewhere, voices rising and falling unpredictably. No alarm was raised, no immediate search began. This delay would later haunt those who survived, but at the time, it reinforced the illusion that everything remained under control. For her, the waiting was the hardest part. The act itself had required a clarity she could not maintain indefinitely. As time passed, sensation returned, the weight of what had been done, the certainty that discovery was inevitable, the knowledge that there would be no escape from consequences. Yet even then, fear did not reclaim its former hold. Whatever terror awaited her was finite. The terror she had lived with for decades had been endless. When the realization finally spread through the household, it did so unevenly. Confusion came first, then irritation, then panic. Questions were asked sharply, accusations flung outward. The assumption remained that responsibility lay somewhere other than where it truly did. The idea that the enslaved woman, so quiet, so compliant, could be at the center of this absence was unthinkable. That disbelief bought her time, though time itself had lost its meaning. As whispers replaced certainty, the plantation's carefully maintained order began to fracture. Fear shifted direction. The master's authority, once unquestioned, now trembled beneath a realization he could not fully articulate. The system he controlled was not as absolute as he believed. The danger he had always imagined from rebellion and escape had manifested in a form he had never considered. Not loud, not collective, but singular and devastating. When the truth could no longer be contained, it was met not with understanding, but with horror stripped of context. The suffering that had shaped her actions was irrelevant to those in power. They did not ask why. They asked how, and how quickly they could erase the implications. The act was framed as monstrosity rather than consequence, madness rather than response. This framing protected the system by isolating the blame. She did not defend herself in the way others expected. There were no pleas, no justifications that fit the language of the court or the plantation. How could there be? The truth of her life could not be compressed into an explanation that those who judged her would accept. Silence, once a survival tactic, returned as a final refusal. If her humanity had never been acknowledged, she would not perform it now for an audience that had already decided her fate. The unthinkable act reverberated beyond the immediate loss. It unsettled neighboring plantations, fueled rumors, tightened controls. Masters spoke in hushed tones about vigilance, about the dangers of proximity, about the need for harsher discipline. They did not see the irony. They did not recognize that their response mirrored the very conditions that had produced the act. Violence, once again, was answered with more violence. For the enslaved community, the event carried a different weight. It was not celebrated, nor was it condemned in simple terms. It existed as a warning and a revelation of how far despair could push someone, and a revelation that power was not as invulnerable as it appeared. The system demanded silence, and so silence prevailed. But beneath that silence, understanding moved quietly, passed in glances rather than words. History would struggle to contain this moment. Official records, if they mentioned it at all, reduced it to fragments stripped of context and humanity. The narrative favored shock over understanding, punishment over reflection. What could not be explained within the logic of slavery was either dismissed or buried. The unthinkable was easier to erase than to confront, yet erasure could not fully succeed. The act lingered as a fracture in the story slavery told about itself. It exposed the lie that cruelty only flowed one way, that suffering could be inflicted without consequence. It forced an uncomfortable recognition that systems built on dehumanization eventually produce acts that defy comprehension, not because the oppressed are inherently monstrous, but because the conditions imposed upon them leave no room for moral survival. In the end, the unthinkable act was not an anomaly. It was a mirror reflecting the violence, neglect, and degradation that had defined plantation life. It did not emerge from nowhere. It was shaped, sharpened, and made possible by a world that fed on human suffering and called it order. The moment the absence could no longer be explained away as childish wandering, the plantation slipped into a different kind of quiet, one sharpened by fear rather than routine. At first, irritation drove the search. Voices rose with impatience. Servants were summoned and dismissed. Rooms were checked with the assumption that disorder, not disaster, was the cause. The master's authority expected compliance from the world itself, and when the world did not immediately respond, his frustration curdled into something darker. Panic did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through unanswered questions and unaccounted time. The house became a maze of movement. Doors opened and sealed, said, with increasing force. Orders were repeated more loudly, as if volume could compensate for uncertainty. Servants were lined up, questioned, dismissed, then summoned again. Each command carried a tremor of unease. The master's wife moved through the rooms with rigid urgency, her composure cracking at the edges. The children's names were spoken again and again, first sharply, then desperately, each repetition eroding the confidence that had once defined the household. Outside, the search expanded into the yards and surrounding land. Overseers were called in, their presence shifting the tone from domestic concern to something more ominous. Dogs were readied, paths retraced, fields scanned. The plantation, once a place of controlled order, became a landscape of suspicion. Every corner seemed suddenly capable of hiding what no one wanted to imagine. The sun climbed higher, and with it rose the awareness that time was no longer on their side. As panic spread, so did silence among the enslaved. It was not a silence of ignorance, but of survival. They watched, listened, and understood far more than they revealed. The plantation had trained them well in this regard. Speaking too much had always been dangerous. Now it was potentially fatal. Eyes met briefly, messages passing without words. No one volunteered information. No one asked questions. In a system where truth was often punished, restraint felt safer than honesty. Rumors began to circulate, soft and fragmented. Whispers slipped between rooms, between glances, between pauses in labor. At first, the rumors contradicted one another, shaped more by fear than fact. Some suggested escape, others accident. Each possibility was clung to briefly, then discarded when it failed to offer relief. The most frightening explanations were the ones least spoken, lingering at the edges of thought where language hesitated to follow. The master's authority responded as it always did when challenged, by tightening its grip. Movement was restricted. Work was suspended and then intensified. Enslaved people were confined to visible areas, their routines disrupted under the guise of necessity. The search became an excuse to assert dominance, to remind everyone who controlled the land and the lives upon it. Yet beneath this show of power lay a profound vulnerability. Control, once absolute, now felt fragile. As hours turned into a day and then another, the household's desperation grew harder to conceal. The master's voice lost its practiced certainty, breaking into sharp commands that revealed more fear than confidence. The mistress's composure collapsed into visible distress, her authority undermined by grief and disbelief. The children's absence tore a hole in the narrative of safety that had surrounded the house, exposing how dependent that narrative was on illusion. When suspicion finally narrowed, it did so reluctantly. The idea that danger had emerged from within the household itself was deeply unsettling. Servants were considered, dismissed, reconsidered. Each possibility challenged the assumptions that structured plantation life. The enslaved woman, so familiar, so unremarkable in the eyes of those who owned her, existed outside the initial scope of blame. Her invisibility, once a tool of survival, now shielded her briefly from accusation. But invisibility has limits. As inconsistencies surfaced and options dwindled, attention shifted. Questions became sharper, less patient. The atmosphere thickened with accusation. When the truth began to emerge, it did not do so cleanly or completely. It arrived in fragments, in discoveries that forced understanding rather than invited it. The realization struck not as a single revelation, but as a series of blows, each one harder to absorb than the last. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Horror eclipsed grief, followed closely by rage. The master's household recoiled from the implications not only of what had happened, but of what it suggested about their world. The narrative they had relied on, that power ensured safety, that obedience guaranteed order, collapsed under the weight of reality. The need to contain this collapse became urgent. Panic gave way to control-oriented responses. The plantation moved quickly to suppress information, to shape the story before it could escape beyond its borders. Servants were warned, threatened, reminded of consequences. Outsiders were given carefully constructed explanations stripped of detail and context. The goal was not truth, but containment. Reputation mattered. Order had to be restored. Even if it meant burying the full reality of events, authorities were involved in ways that reflected the values of the time. The focus was not on understanding causes, but on assigning blame and reasserting dominance. The enslaved woman was no longer invisible. She became a symbol onto which fear and outrage were projected. Her humanity, never acknowledged in life, was now erased entirely in the language used to describe her. She was framed not as a product of a brutal system, but as an aberration within it. For the enslaved community, the aftermath unfolded with a mixture of dread and grim clarity. Retaliation was expected. Increased surveillance, harsher discipline, reduced rations, all followed as predictably as sunrise. The system responded to its own failure by intensifying the very conditions that had led to it. Fear, already pervasive, deepened into something heavier, more suffocating. Yet beneath that fear, a quiet understanding spread. The plantation was not invulnerable. The illusion of absolute control had been cracked. The event cast a long shadow over daily life. Conversations became more guarded, routines more rigid. Trust, already scarce, eroded further. The master's household operated with heightened suspicion, interpreting ordinary actions as potential threats. This paranoia infected every interaction, poisoning relationships and reinforcing isolation. Plantation became a place not just of oppression, but of mutual fear, where dominance could not fully protect against consequence. Beyond the plantation, the story traveled unevenly. Some heard only fragments, others distorted versions shaped by prejudice and fear. The narrative that spread emphasized monstrosity and betrayal, carefully avoiding any mention of the conditions that had preceded the act. This selective telling served a purpose. It reassured other masters that the system itself was sound, that the danger lay in individual deviance rather than structural cruelty. Yet rumors have a way of carrying what official stories omit. In quiet spaces, away from scrutiny, people wondered. They asked questions they would never voice openly. What kind of suffering could produce such an outcome? What did it mean that the threat had come from someone so close, so thoroughly controlled? These questions lingered, unanswered but persistent, unsettling the certainty that slavery depended upon. The plantation eventually resumed its routines, as systems of oppression always do. Crops were harvested, meals prepared, orders given. On the surface, life continued. But something had shifted irrevocably. The disappearance and its aftermath had exposed a truth the plantation could not fully suppress. Control achieved through fear is never complete, and silence does not equal peace. In the end, the panic and the silence told the same story from opposite sides. Panic revealed the fragility of power when confronted with the unexpected. Silence revealed the depth of understanding among those who had learned to survive within that power. Together, they formed the unspoken legacy of what had happened, a legacy that would linger long after official accounts had been written, shaping memory in ways that no amount of suppression could fully erase. What followed after the panic subsided was not justice in any meaningful sense, but a process designed to restore authority and erase discomfort. The plantation could not afford reflection. Reflection implied responsibility, and responsibility threatened the foundations upon which everything rested. Instead, events were narrowed, simplified, and framed in a way that allowed the system to remain intact. What had happened was treated not as a consequence, but as an aberration, something foreign to the natural order rather than produced by it. Judgment came swiftly, shaped by laws that had never recognized her humanity in the first place. The language used to describe her shifted immediately, stripping away even the minimal acknowledgement of personhood she had possessed. She was no longer spoken of as a woman, or even as a slave, but as a thing that had malfunctioned. Terms like madness, savagery, and monstrosity replaced any attempt at explanation. This transformation made punishment easier to justify. One does not seek to understand a monster. One seeks only to destroy it. There was no true trial as modern minds would understand it. The outcome was decided long before formalities began. Evidence existed only to confirm what power already believed. Her voice carried no weight, not because she remained silent, but because the system was deaf by design. Even if she had spoken, her words would have been dismissed as manipulation or deceit. The truth of her life did not fit within the narrow frame allowed to her. Punishment was not solely about her. It was a performance intended to reassure those who benefited from the system and terrify those trapped within it. The message was clear. Any challenge to the established order, no matter how rare or desperate, would be met with absolute force. The plantation needed closure, and closure in this context meant removal. Once she was gone, the narrative could be sealed, the rupture smoothed over, her fate was recorded briefly, if at all. Names were misspelled or omitted, details blurred or deliberately obscured. Official documents focused on property loss and social disturbance rather than human suffering. The loss that mattered was not her life, but the breach of control. The system documented itself carefully while allowing her story to dissolve into fragments. Afterward, the plantation returned to its routines with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Discipline tightened. Surveillance increased. Enslaved people were reminded repeatedly of their place, as if repetition could erase memory. The master's authority, though outwardly restored, now carried an undercurrent of insecurity. Power had been challenged, not publicly, but effectively. That knowledge could not be undone. For those who remained enslaved, her absence was felt in complex ways. Fear dominated as expected. No one doubted that reprisals would follow, and they did. But alongside fear lived something quieter and harder to name. Her actions were not celebrated, nor were they easily condemned. They existed in a space beyond simple moral judgment, shaped by an understanding outsiders could not access. She became a presence in memory, rather than a subject of discussion, invoked silently rather than spoken aloud. Erasure became policy. The master's family avoided mention of what had occurred, framing it as a tragedy best forgotten. Visitors were given sanitized explanations. Children were shielded from details not to protect them from horror, but to preserve the illusion that their world remained orderly and safe. Silence was presented as dignity, forgetting as healing, but forgetting never fully succeeds when pain has been this extreme. Stories survived in altered forms, passed quietly among those who understood the cost of speaking too openly. Details shifted, names changed, but the core remained. There was a woman. There was unbearable suffering. There was a moment when fear no longer governed action. These fragments endured not as legend, but as warning. Outside the plantation, the broader society absorbed the story in distorted ways. Newspapers, when they mentioned it at all, framed it as proof of the dangers of enslaved proximity, reinforcing calls for harsher controls. The lesson drawn was never about cruelty, only about containment. Sympathy flowed upward, never downward. The system defended itself by redefining the event as justification for its own brutality. History, written by those with the power to write it, largely complied. The incident became a footnote or vanished entirely. What could not be reconciled with the narrative of benevolent authority was either reshaped or ignored. Slavery preferred stories of loyalty and obedience. A story like hers disrupted that preference, so it was pushed to the margins, and yet the very act of erasure testified to its significance. Systems do not work so hard to bury what is meaningless. Her story threatened because it revealed a truth too dangerous to confront openly, that extreme oppression does not eliminate agency, it distorts it, that suffering denied expression does not disappear, it accumulates, that violence imposed daily will eventually return in forms that shock those who believe themselves immune. Her life, reduced to a symbol of horror by those in power, held a different meaning when viewed honestly. It was not a tale of inherent evil, but of systematic destruction. She had been denied autonomy, dignity, family, nourishment, and safety. She had been taught through pain that her life had no value. When a person is pushed into such a corner, the moral frameworks that govern ordinary life no longer apply cleanly. This does not excuse what occurred, but it demands understanding rather than caricature. The tragedy extended beyond individual loss. It lay in what the system required to function and what it produced as a result. Her story exposed the lie at the heart of plantation order, that control equaled stability. In reality, control maintained through fear created volatility, not peace. The violence that erupted was not a rupture from the system, but a reflection of it. Long after the plantation itself faded, absorbed by time and change, the unanswered questions remained. They lingered in the spaces history left blank. What responsibility does a society bear when it creates conditions that strip people of humanity? How many stories like hers were silenced before they could ever surface? How many were lost entirely, leaving no trace behind? Her erasure was meant to restore order, but it also revealed the fragility of that order. By trying to bury her story, the system admitted its own vulnerability. It could punish bodies, but it could not fully control memory, even distorted, even incomplete. Her story endured as an indictment written between the lines of official history. In the end, judgment was delivered swiftly, and silence followed just as quickly. But silence is not the same as resolution. It is merely absence of sound, not absence of meaning. Her story, stripped from records and denied nuance, still speaks through. The discomfort it causes when uncovered, it forces confrontation with a past that resists neat explanations. She was judged, erased, and buried, but the system that shaped her actions could not bury its own responsibility. That responsibility lingers, carried forward by those willing to look beyond shock and ask harder questions. Her story does not offer comfort. It offers understanding, and understanding in this case is far more unsettling.